Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Section at Scale. Today, I'm here with Dave Herrald, who's the global head of cybersecurity go-to-market at Databricks. Dave, how are we doing?
Doing great, Jack. Thanks for having me. A longtime listener, so I'm very honored to be here. Yeah, looking forward to a good conversation.
Likewise. So you've had a really interesting career. Why don't we start there? Can you give a brief background on how you've sort of progressed through security and how it led to where you are today at Databricks?
Yeah, for sure. I've actually been at it quite a long time. I stopped updating my sort of like, intro slide at talks at, somewhere like in the around the mid 20s, like when I hit about 25 years, I was like, okay, I'm just going to sort of keep it there. and not say how many years I've actually been in, but it's been a long time. Yeah, I mean, I'm a kid of, child of the 80s, I had the personal computer and learned how to program in BASIC in the 80s, and then off to college and kind of saw the internet kind of as we know it start to unfold. When I showed up, we were using FTP and Telnet to get around the internet, and then when I left, we had web browsers, and that was a cool transformation. But yeah, I kind of fell into the sort of Unix sysadmin, C programmer, like Cisco network engineer persona, kind of my when I first kind of entered the workforce, and so worked in IT, and eventually I was working at a payments startup. And the CEO walked in and dropped this sort of packet of papers on my desk, and it was actually a copy of the Visa CISP program, which was the forerunner to the PCI DSS. And he said, hey, we have to comply with this. Otherwise, we're going to get kicked off all of the payment platforms where we process transactions, which means we go out of business. And so from that day on, I was a security person. Yeah. Today, we might like not think that the compliance is maybe the best way to get into security, but 20 years ago, it was super effective way to get into security. So, and eventually worked up, my way up to a CISO role, and of a kind of a medium-sized team, and very hands-on. Did that for, I don't know, about 7 years. And then I started a different journey on the vendor side of the house. So I worked at Splunk for about 7 years. Most recently, I worked at Google on their Chronicle SecOps team last few years. And then, yeah, I just had this opportunity to join Databricks, and it kind of aligned with my mission of just kind of helping practitioners like find the very best like way to handle data and extract value from that data in their security programs. And so, yeah, I think at Splunk, we ran this program called Boss of the SOC, which maybe a lot of people have heard, but my buddy Ryan and I kind of started that in 2016. And I'll never forget actually the 10th version of that is coming up at the Splunk conference for anybody that will be there. But so I'm glad that lives on. But, I think back to that first Boss of the SOC, and afterward we had people walk up to us and say, I learned so much. Or, when things like that happen in our real environment, I get pushed aside because there's a senior, analyst that sort of takes over, and I don't get to like learn. And I think from that moment on, I was like, that's what I do in security, right? Is I enable practitioners to be better and be better with data. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm embarking on at Databricks as well.
Super interesting. The first thing that comes to my mind is how is Databricks approaching this problem of security analytics? Because Databricks in its core is based on Spark, right? It's based on high scale analytics, but for BI. So how are you all thinking about applying it in cyber?
Yeah, I think Databricks is been super successful in sort of the high performance, Spark based, transformation, sort of like extremely horizontally scalable, analytics, and then building data warehouses on top of that. And there's literally like billions of dollars of value like being created by that platform, but it's all happening in like data centric problem spaces, but not in security, essentially, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity there to sort of apply what I think are the best sort of data tools out there to the security problem space. And you do see that, with our customers. In fact, we have a lot of customers that use Databricks for security, but when you sort of peel back that onion and talk to those customers, there's typically like a very visionary kind of builder centric leader in those security programs, which is amazing. I love, every opportunity to talk to those folks. But the reality is like they're not the typical security leader, perhaps, right? And so I think one thing you'll see from us is just like trying to bring some of that capability to make it a little easier for more of our customers to consume. So, you always have to start with data ingest and then, think about, hey, what are the detection, what are the sort of the traditional threat detection libraries, but then also like, hey, what are the actual more interesting, forward leaning detection capabilities, right? And so, those are the things we're going to be tackling over the next few years here.
How do you think Databricks really changes the traditional paradigm of like block storage? Because you all are innovating quite a lot on that layer, especially with the acquisition of the Iceberg team and all of that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you sort of see that playing in with SOC.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had a nickel for every time that somebody just said, hey, why can't I just keep my security data in an S3 bucket on Amazon, or why can't I just use like cloud object storage, right? And I think that is like a very kind of specific thing that people are like, hey, I know there's cheaper ways to store my data, and why can't I use that for security, right? And I think one thing that Databricks has done really successfully is sort of the separation of storage and compute. And so you can literally store your data in an S3 bucket. You can have full control over that, full visibility, and then use Spark and data warehousing techniques to like add structure to that. And Iceberg and Delta table and Parquet files, these are all like open formats that we embrace really deeply, contribute to all of them. And I think for me, the coolest part of that is like, if I'm a customer, like my retention and, the amount of data that I keep and really the data that I select to put into my analytics platform is honestly like very cleanly separated from the analytics vendor. It's really becomes like a conversation between the customer and their cloud service provider about how they store that data. So I think that's a huge differentiator right there. And I think, it finally addresses like the cost. I mean, sometimes customers are worried about the cost of their data platform, but I would say more often customers are worried about the cost structure, meaning like, why does everything I learned throughout my entire security career lead me to a conclusion that says I should keep more data for more visibility, all these things, right? But then when I talk to vendors, I'm sort of like, it's sort of antithetical to that, right? And so I'm not suggesting that you should keep every piece of data in your environment, but having a little bit of choice around that is I think, a welcome difference when I talk to folks. And, there's governance, like being able to do row based and column based, different kinds of access control and discoverability. But, and from a processing perspective, I think it's also like when you look at using SQL and Python for analytics, that might be a learning curve for many analysts in our industry to adopt those things. But, the nice thing is that they tend to be supersets of other technologies they might be used to. And so there's typically a path there to express, the analytics that you might need. And so these are all like characteristics of, I think, just the data lake or the, Delta Lake, as we call it sometimes for cyber.
Mhm. So let's do a little thought experiment here. So there's a lot of emerging technologies that we're talking about in here. We're talking about data lakes, and we're talking about this transition from more monolithic SIM platforms with indexers like a Splunk or whatever into a very, very advanced analytics platform. So the thought experiment is like, I want us to fast forward like 5 years. Like, what is your perfect end-to-end SIM and SOC look like from the ingestion all the way to resolution?
Yeah. I just mentioned a few of the things, right? But I think having, being in control of your data, and in like direct ownership of your data is a big thing. I think, understanding, being able to sort of create the retention period that works for you for particular types of data. I think that, in the future, from a normalization perspective, I think a vendor's job is to have, a prescriptive point of view on normalization, but not a restrictive point of view. So, for customers who want to, or, for users who want to, hey, I just want to get my data in and make it usable, maybe apply, libraries of detections, that sort of thing. That's easy for me to follow prescriptive guidance and maybe, have data, stored in a certain framework, but then also, the ability to sort of depart from that if it makes sense. But then, really at that point, once the data is in the platform, I feel like, the way we think about things today is like a traditional, threat detection library, like basically, and we think about correlation, but largely we think about like, hey, what's the relational set of operations I can do on that data, right? Like I can select things, I can join things, filter them, and select columns, and and those tend to drive like a lot of the detections that you see in SIM platforms today. But then that's just kind of one little view of the world, in my opinion. I think like graph analysis, right, just writ large, is a huge one that we're hearing from many big customers. Like they want to use graphs for all manner of different security analytic techniques. Like they want to, create a graph of all the systems in their like turn their CMDB into a graph that's queryable. They want to use graphs to like, scope breaches or to help prioritize vulnerability, remediation, or, just to determine blast radius, things like that. But then, that's sort of another category, right? Graphs. And then it's like, well, there's, RAG applications, and there's all sorts of other sort of AI kind of, specific ways that we can look at data. And I think that's unfolding still. But the nice thing is like by taking care of like the operational pieces and like getting costs under control and access and things like that, you've sort of readied yourself for more advanced analytics. And I see like many of those emerging.
What do you think are like the phases of building a security operation center on top of a platform like Databricks? Like where do you see people start?
Yeah.
And then how do you see them sort of progress through maturity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess you can kind of look at it in some different ways. Like one way I kind of mentioned earlier was like you have sort of a visionary person who's like, hey, I want to use the best data tools for this data problem. And that's cool because they're willing to see past things like, hey, I don't, there's no connector published for that data source, right? And they're like, oh, I'm going to have to maybe engineer a data pipeline to get that data in, but I know it's worth it, right? So, I mean, there's kind of that builder mentality, but then we also see lots of security teams coming to us who say things like, hey, there's 5 other teams here who are using Databricks for all manner of different data use cases. And our leadership is like, hey, why don't we, look at using security or using Databricks for security as well? So that's like kind of another path that I think, it's our job, my job to pave that path a little bit better, because, the reality is like, there's no free lunch as far as like, you have to get data into a platform before you can use it. You typically have to map it to some sort of a semantic layer, which we often call, in security, our semantic layer is often, a normalization framework like OCSF or, Ceph or common information model, or, there's ECS, et cetera. But, mapping to one of those standards. And then, that's when you can really start like using the data and using it over and over again for lots of different use cases. So, that I think getting data in and getting it normalized are the kind of necessary first steps. And then of course, you also have, because we live in the real world, right? And SIMs are so deeply embedded in, the culture and the operations of most security organizations. Like you have all different sorts of like, hey, how can I augment, an existing SIM with maybe a data platform, and how would they tie together, like which data would go where and in what order, and routing and those kinds of things. And so that's more of a transitional state, I think, the augmentation piece, but it's very real. Like we definitely like, I spend a lot of time talking to customers about how to go through that sort of necessary transition state.
Where all this ends up is AI agents, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the funny thing about AI, just for me in general, is like, having been in the industry for a long time, been on both sides of being a customer, being a vendor, and I'm actually like very skeptical about new so-called new things in security, right? Like, I mean, if you think 5 years ago, like everybody was talking about zero trust, but like, okay, that's cool and useful in certain cases, but like you still have a podcast, everybody's still working in cyber, like we didn't solve cyber with any of these things that came in the past, right? And so as AI kind of came into the forefront of everybody's mind, it was like, okay, is this real? Like, is this really going to help us? Like, or is this going to be sort of another thing that kind of comes and goes? And so, it took me probably a little longer to like jump in and be a true believer of that AI is like going to revolutionize security as it's revolutionizing, pretty much everything in our in our world at the moment. And yeah, I think agents obviously are one of the most like useful manifestations of AI for us. So we have a lot of ways to build agents in Databricks, but aside from that, I think you are seeing it, like you're seeing customers like successfully using agents. Especially, I think the pattern I'm seeing with some of our customers is like sort of a high number of more focused agents. Like, okay, I don't have an agent that is like, hey, replace my human security analyst. That agent doesn't exist, in my opinion. But there's a lot of agents that make that analyst way more effective. Like, hey, I need an enrichment agent, right? That's going to pick up a case, pick up an event, and understand, hey, based on what's in that event, I know I can enrich that with geolocation data and threat intel data and information from our HR system or CMDB and those more narrow, and that's not that narrow like what I just described, right? But it's narrower than sort of the Uber agent, but like having those types of agents defined are like producing real results, I think, for customers I'm talking to. And yeah, I think, sometimes it's an agent that's working autonomously, but then, there's also just sort of like this ability to sort of chat with your data, if you will, which is something that's a kind of a Databricks thing, but we can essentially jump into a tool we call Genie that like allows us to just ask, very broad questions and not worry about knowing, hey, maybe I don't know my normalization framework. I don't know what those fields are called. Or maybe my data isn't even normalized. And I want to ask questions like, how many emails were blocked, by our email security control yesterday, and just ask a simple question like that. And people sometimes feel like that's a more chat-based, interface, but it feels agentic, right? So, I mean, sometimes those lines get blurred a little bit, but either way, it's extremely valuable.
I really, really love the idea of a high number of focused agents. I totally think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Why do you think people are seeing more success there versus the broad SOC analyst, like mono agent?
Yeah. I mean, I just think there's way, way too much nuance, that's built into like what a typical like security analyst does, like especially one who's very skilled in investigation, very skilled in pivoting, knowing when to pivot, knowing, where to pivot to, knowing when to go broad versus go deep. And, those are, still things I always think of my good friend Chris Sanders and like some of the like courses and things that he's built that are, like literally a very, multi-day, at least multi-day kind of, class on investigation, right? And, these are things that you can study, but then also it takes years to build up that. And I think we're just not quite there yet. Like AI is not quite there yet to like, I think, embody quite that much like human intuition and nuance. Maybe we'll get there, but I think in the meantime, it's like, hey, I can sort of narrow down the scope of what I'm asking this particular agent to do and get like much more effective results, right? Make it just a little bit more, move that slider a little bit more back to the deterministic side of things. Like I want you to be an AI agent. I want you to use creativity to solve this, but I'm not expecting you to literally, replace a human mind, at least not yet.
What's your perspective on good prompt engineering for foundation models versus the need for fine tuning a open source model? Like, are you seeing people have success or
Yeah.
bias on one side?
Yeah. I think prompt engineering is something that, there's definitely like a Pareto rule there. Like you can learn a little bit of prompt engineering and gain like a massive amount of improvement in like, how your system responds, right? And the effectiveness that you get from an AI agent. I think fine tuning is a, potentially time consuming and an expensive process if you go by kind of the definition of, of fine tuning. And so, I think prompt engineering, I also think, some of the stuff that's happening with like DSPY, if you've seen that, where it's a little bit more of a programmatic approach to prompting that can sort of include, a lot of the things that you might have just like, okay, I saw that on Twitter. It's important for me to tell this model that this problem is really important and don't mess up and put sort of all these odds and ends into your prompts. But like I think there's tools emerging around that to say, hey, how can I build a prompt in a little bit more of a repeatable, programmable way? I think that's got a ton of promise. And then, I think you also see tools like our Agentbricks tool, for example, that, well, a step back, it's actually not that hard to build an agent, right? Like it's fairly straightforward, but the problems are, how do I get that agent to use my data, my company's data effectively? But then also like, how does that agent improve over time? Like how would I know if the agent is working better today than it did yesterday or the same? And I think so a lot of those sort of measurement capabilities and then improvement, sort of like doing A/B testing and things, but doing those in an automated way, I think are super important. Like those are the kinds of things I think you'll see around agent development kind of going forward.
Yeah, I fully agree on the prompt engineering side. And, I think I'm pretty extreme in my opinion, but I feel like agents can do at least 80 to 90% of what security teams are doing. And the reason I say that is security just requires an insane amount of breadth.
Yeah.
And I think this is why it's so hard to staff these teams effectively. You have to know cloud infrastructure, you have to know attacker techniques, you have to know how SIM works, you have to know how logs work, and now you have to know how agents work. So it's like trying to find people to create all of this, and you're not even talking about managing the outcomes, which is alerts and incidents, and then you have to work those, and you have to do containment. So I say that agents can take 80 to 90%, because it's 80 to 90% of things that those teams should not be doing themselves. And I was just looking at this too. I'm like, I do not want to look at machine generated logs anymore.
Yeah.
I just think there's no point, right? If I can chat with my data, like you're saying,
Yeah.
I don't have to think about the schema. I don't have to think about the log type. I don't even have to think about optimizing that query. I just get my answer and I keep going. And that's where I'm really bullish. And it's going to take some time for the industry to get there, but I'm just seeing so many good results here. And, you made a comment I thought was pretty funny too, right? You said when LLMs became more prominent, like, oh my God, is this real? Is this an actual thing?
Right.
We had a partner say that to us because we were demoing our MCP server to them. And, our MCP server allows the same thing. You can chat with your data, and we have schemas and all of that as part of it. And they literally say the same thing. They're like, is this I just want to check, like, this is a real thing, right? This
Yeah.
isn't just a demo magic. And the team's like, no, this is real. Like, you can do this now.
Well, you do have to, I think, be pretty patient with security folks, because that skepticism has been like a survival, like a necessary survival, like a survival tactic for us for a long time. And so, yeah, I think, yeah, I see that. I see that often as well. Your point about 80 to 90%, like, or, whatever that percentage is some high percentage. I don't think that's extreme, right? And I think if you work in a SOC, it's not extreme, because I think most analysts are doing things, right, that you wouldn't expect that they have to do, right? When an alert comes in, it's like, they might be able to make a triage type decision in a fairly short period of time, but in order to get to that decision point, you might have to do 30 minutes or 60 minutes of context gathering, right? Like, what, and based on the alert, right? And it's like, well, okay, I don't know who this user is. It's a giant company, right? We have 10,000 users or 100,000 users. So, like, are they, is this an important user? Is it an executive? Is it, an IT administrator? What do they have access to? What do they normally do? What region are they located in? Like all these things and like a skilled analyst will start immediately gathering this context, right? Because context allows you to make the decision. And so, I kind of thought, back in the day when SOAR, when the SOAR, product category kind of was, emerging, that, SOAR would be the answer there. Like, okay, we're going to write a playbook that's going to, like, enrich every event that comes in, right? And, that to some degree can work, but, requires a ton of, programming, ton of, like, deterministic, code creation, and, lots of error checking and handling, and all these things that go along with that. And, I think now you can say, hey, if I can have an agent that's somewhat flexible within those bounds of, like, context gathering / enrichment, I think it's very reasonable, to your point of like getting somewhere where we say, hey, 80 to 90% of that kind of work can be removed. And then, we have humans who essentially are super powered in their old role, compared to the way they were prepared for their role. They're now superhuman, supercharged.
Right. How would you answer someone who says, well, what about hallucinations?
I would say that, I would say, from a very practical perspective, it's like, hey, that is the engineering task that remains, right? To help engineer those things out of your agent, right? And there are ways that you can, minimize that. But, I guess one thing I would say is, like, hey, what did you do the last time your human analyst made a mistake in context gathering, or didn't gather the right context, or, made a bad decision, when they did have the context? And so, I think, those things exist today. They'll probably exist, for some time going forward. Again, we can engineer those things out, or minimize them. But I would say that if we let that stop us from, let something like that stop us from, realizing all this value, then we're probably doing ourselves a disservice collectively. But, I certainly am not, like, hallucinations exist, and they can be, problematic. I think it's, yeah, like anything, it's like, you hear stories about hallucination, and they tend to sometimes are funny, sometimes are very disturbing, but then, quietly, in the, sort of in the background, these things are being improved constantly all the time. You don't necessarily hear the funny anecdote about those things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's a prompt engineering, AI engineering solve.
Yeah.
And the ways that I personally observe hallucinations happening is when the context is incomplete. And one example of that is, let's say a query fails for some reason, or it's incomplete and gives you partial results. It will create a disposition based on those partial results, and it might be wrong.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily hallucinating, right? Because it's drawing the conclusion based on what it knows.
Yeah.
And I think when you approach it from that perspective, then use solution with like, well, I need to give it more. I need to give it more context about that identity or that user, or
Yeah.
I need to teach it how to pivot more effectively. But those are just super detail oriented, highly time consuming tasks that I still very strongly feel that humans no longer need to do. And I want more people to get exposed to it. And I think MCP is actually a really great way for people to get exposed to agents, because MCP focuses on a core layer of tools and foundation models. And when you understand those two concepts together, then you can start to create agents that are super effective.
Yeah. Yeah. We're definitely aligned on that. I think, yeah, I think of all the times I've just like used AI poorly, right? Like I jump in and I'm using AI like Google and instead of like thinking about, creating a prompt that's, can allow the LLM to help me the most. And, it will overfit. Like you think you're mentioning something like just casually, like to like, okay, think about maybe, hey, this little piece of information that I'm adding, and then it just completely pivots to like thinking that, okay, that is the goal. I should copy, everything that I know about that particular thing. And it's like, and then you're like, oh, this is hallucinating. But then you look back at the prompt and you're like, yeah, I didn't really hold up my end of the bargain with the prompt that I provided, right? And so yeah, and I've seen overfitting on incomplete data as well, like you say. And so, yeah, it's like recognizing when those things happen, and you can engineer around those things and increasingly more easily. But when I say around, I say like you can reduce the likelihood of those things happening and perhaps mitigate when they do happen. Not so much elimination, right?
Mm-hmm. And, agent speaks also to another thing you mentioned, which is SOAR requires a lot of upkeep. It requires tuning the playbooks, and a big sell of using agents is that you no longer need to do that. Are you seeing that come true so far?
I think, I've worked with a lot of SOAR systems and a lot of vendors that sell them. And, I think it's interesting actually, like it's kind of a parallel to the thing mentioned earlier where, yeah, if you, with agents, right, if you can sort of narrow their scope a little bit, you tend to have more success. And like, that's where I've seen like customers have success with SOAR as well. Like having to do like, a very specific thing with my SOAR playbook. And that's an area where I think you can like imagine the inputs and outputs and error conditions and more easily like take advantage of a platform like that. But still, I won't say always, but because there's a lot of low code, no code SOARs out there now. But traditionally it was like, hey, you're requiring like a Python programming skill set and some sense of just imperative programming to like take advantage of that. So the bar tended to be a little bit higher. But with SOAR, the thing that honestly most customers that I've seen with success with SOAR recently is the case management pieces of it, right? And so like that's a place where they can center their activities around and put use case notes and collaboration and those kinds of things. I think that capability is still kind of critical, to have in at least present in your in your tool stack somewhere. And so, from that perspective, I think SOAR has been extremely successful and valuable, like from the case management side. Yeah.
Awesome. Dave, I want to wrap the show with 3 pieces of advice. So
Okay.
if folks are
Rating. You have 3
okay,
pieces of advice for me?
it's not typically from me, it's from you. I'm not prepared to answer that question, but I'd love to hear your perspective here for teams that are
yeah.
entering this world. Yeah.
Well, I think if I did think about this a little bit before the show. I think one thing I mentioned earlier is like, find in security, I think it's easy to get very burnt out very quickly. And so I think the thing for me, after 30 some years working in this industry is, finding what your mission is and sort of like thinking about that sort of every day and think about that in terms of like, that usually transcends the company you work for and the project that you're working on. And so, I think about, hey, how do I make blue team security practitioners better at their job and faster and allow them to like provide more value to their organization. And so I'd say find your mission in security. And it tends to sort of, as you have the highs and the lows as you're going through your career, it tends to be something that can allow you to get centered. So be mission focused, I would say. Yeah. Number two, I mentioned earlier is like, now is a really bad time to be tuned out of what's going on with AI. So I would say from a security perspective, even though, our instincts and our might be to like, hey, let's not maybe think about that because, it's probably a trend or it might not be something that really impacts me. I think this is one that's going to change security along with everything else. So I'd say be very tuned in on AI. And then, yeah, the third one I would say is just like learn by be a continuous learner, but learn by building and by publishing. And publishing is not maybe as scary as it sounds, but like, talk about what you're doing on LinkedIn or Twitter or, micro publishing, if you will, and share what you're doing. But, there's a big difference between like listening to things, but then turning around and doing things and building things. And so I think that's what really is going to kind of push folks forward. So yeah. And then number 4 is like, find some hobby that is like completely disconnected from tech, I think. So
Can you explain that one?
yeah, woodworking, riding your bike, any of those are all things that I do to just kind of like, okay, I'm just going to go and be very disconnected from technology for a while. So.
Well, why is that your number 4?
It probably could be earlier. I just thought of it. It was a late ad, but yeah, I could probably say that might be the most important thing for all of us.
Because the job is stressful and having a time away from that, or something else?
I think the job is stressful. I think also just, I like the concept. I mean, I like the concept of building things, from a technology perspective, but it's always interesting to me when I mess something up, with some code that I'm writing or a project and I can like delete the project or I can roll it back in Git or whatever. And it's like, there's really no downside other than maybe a little time that I spent. But when you're working sort of with your hands, there's a more sort of real, there's a very sort of real aspect. I feel very connected to, hey, there's real outcomes to like my skill with how I'm, planing this piece of wood. And, if I mess it up, there's sort of this very real sort of outcome around that. Like, oh, now I'm gonna have to like throw that board away or something. And so, to me, it's something I find very kind of very soothing, honestly. Just exercises a different part of my brain. So.
Well, you got to send me a photo of something that you've built, and then I'll put it on the blog when I publish on this.
I'll send it to you. Porcupine Woodworks. Yeah, that's my retirement job, hopefully.
Amazing. Do you have a website? Do you have a website yet?
Instagram.
Instagram?
Yeah.
Okay, I love it.
Yes.
I think my version of that is more centered around like cooking and health and longevity. I think that's kind of where I
love it.
Find the hobbies outside of tech and security, even though I do apply tech to those. And there's some really interesting things happening there, which is not the purpose of this podcast. But, I like the emphasis of this connection. And I really love the emphasis of mission, because one is really around what's the motivation for everything that you do? What's important to you? What are your immediate goals? Like that's mission driven, right? And then the other side of that is like, how do you take time away from that to reflect and let your thoughts settle? And that can be doing these other things like health or whatever. So yeah, I think those are great pieces of advice. I really appreciate those. This was a great show. I really appreciate you coming on, Dave.
Likewise. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jack. I'm definitely been a long time listener and it's an honor to be here. I appreciate you.
Yeah, of course. We're going to publish this on detectionatscale.com. So if you're listening in, you can go check that out, find all the other episodes and some blog posts about a lot of things that Dave and I talked about today. But yeah, thanks again, Dave, and see y'all soon.